We are recording, and I guess we'll just jump right into it. Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 8 of Pop It Like It's Hot. We are coming to you live, as always, courtesy of RIW Hobbies and Games in Livonia, Michigan. My name is Chris, and I am here with my co-hosts. They're going to introduce themselves right now.
I'm Brian DeMars. Hello.
This is Dave again.
And then we have a very special guest here with us today, Alex Ullman. You might be familiar with him. He hosted the Pauper Premier League and puts out content all the time on Channel Fireball on his blog. Alex, how you doing?
I'm doing all right. How are you guys tonight?
Excellent. This was a fun week in Pauper.
Depends on your definition of fun.
Well, I got to play in a Magic Online playoff for the format. That's not something you get to do every day.
4 times a year, I think, if the math's correct. And then there's also the MCQs. So, but it was quite a playoff, wasn't it?
It really was. The top 8, I mean, as everybody expected, we had Elves taking it down. They beat Green Eldrazi Ramp in the finals. You know, really cookie cutter. Outside of that, we had 4 Jeskai, a Tron, and a Stompy. That's a little bit more what everybody expected. What were your guys' thoughts on this?
Yeah, land grant in elves. Who knew? Two longbows in the main deck and a trinket mage, because that's the coolest creature around right now for getting 1-man artifacts. So that was wild.
Yeah, I mean, I was definitely surprised to see Elves take it down. It seems like that's been the trend lately. You either see Jeskai, take the top spot, or just some kind of one-off rogue deck that's just sort of the flavor of the moment, doing what nobody expects them to do.
I think the thing about that Elves deck is that it came extremely prepared to face sweepers because it packed 4 Lead the Stampede, 4 Winding Way, and no copies of Distant Melody. Kendra Smith, who is the co-host for the Pauper Premier League, Elves specialist, talked a lot about how these 2 cards mean that you can rebuild from a board wipe a lot faster. And you can even see that in the pilot's sideboard plan. Let's pull up their name real quick. Federusher. They also have Vivian's Grizzly, which is just a way to, if you have any amount of mana, you can just dig to creatures. And they also kind of lucked out. They only had to face off against 3 copies of Electrickery and 1 Swirling Sandstorm in the top 8. I mean, if you're an Elves deck, that's not a ton. You can easily rebuild from that, and that's over 3 decks.
Yeah, absolutely. And, the utility of Electrickery recently has kind of gone down, with Delver being almost a non-factor in the metagame. So, whereas most people were packing 2 to 3 copies by default, maybe 6 or 8 months ago, nowadays we're seeing, Jeskai decks are kind of tuning to beat each other, and Electrickery is just sort of falling off a lot of people's radar. Do you expect that to change coming up in the next few tournament results we see?
I mean, I think that Pauper is really good at adjusting for the deck of the week and less good at adjusting for what is clearly the best interaction. We saw this a couple weeks ago when Heroic and Boggles did really well. The next week you saw almost none of those decks, and you saw a ton of copies of Leave No Trace, Serene Heart, Ray of Revelation. But then you saw the same number of Jeskai decks. So what you're really seeing is that when there's a clear number 1, it can be hard to take it down without, kind of overloading on niche or like subpar cards. I talked a little bit about how more people should be running Magma Spray as opposed to Lightning Bolt right now, or Scred. But you need kind of like the Dredge effect in Legacy and Vintage. You need a certain number of people who are willing to run those cards to kind of keep that down. Whereas you only need 1 or 2 people to run Leave No Trace to kind of blow Boggles out in any given tournament.
Yeah, I mean, there's only 1 Elves deck in this top 8. It's not like this top 8 is stacked around Elves.
Yeah.
It just so happens that it won because it had good matchups. Because it is the underdog in the metagame, at least this week.
Yeah, it seems like that's something we're seeing a lot lately, and we mentioned it earlier with Boggles and Leave No Trace, where Jeskai is so prevalent, and that's really all that anybody seems to be preparing for. So you're seeing all these strategies that are good. I mean, Boggles and Elves are good decks.
Yeah.
But they're getting pushed to the fringes of the metagame just because Jeskai and Tron, and specifically the Muldrifter Ephemerate combo, is just that powerful. I mean, I think the number was something like 60+% of the decks that had a winning record in the playoff were running Muldrifter and Ephemerate.
So I did the math. It was 62.5% of the top 16. So that is it's 10. 10 of the 16 decks were running the Arkham's Astrolabe Muldrifter Ephemerate engine. And, 2 of those were Tron decks, so they replaced Archaeomancer with Mnemonic Wall. But that's kind of overwhelming when you think about it.
Yeah.
I still think the Jeskai decks are discovering what the best, maybe 2 versions, I guess Tron aside, what are they looking like? You see Seeker of the Way falling off, you see less Pulse and Marasa than a few weeks ago, and now we're seeing, I think, Ninja and maybe Thraben Inspector are coming on to maybe steer the deck in a different way, but a lot of them are on like 14 creatures now, so you're not seeing the heavier, the more aggressive, slanted, I would say, creature builds. Yeah, I think we're coming close to a spot where you have 2 decks that fully diverge from each other instead of having 8 lists that are 6 cards apart from each other. Yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned Ninja the Deep Hours. Bilster had a copy of that in his sideboard that was a pretty spicy choice, in my opinion. It really is keeping these creature light versions of some of these decks honest, and giving them a better card draw engine into the late game. But I guess the question that all this brings up, because I mean, we've been talking for weeks and months about Jeskai and what's the best build of Jeskai, and talking about what percentage of the top 8 it's taking in all these big tournaments. And I guess the question, are the results that we've been seeing lately typical of what you would consider a healthy format?
For me, and this is something, if you follow me at all on Twitter, I get into this way too often for my own good. I think the problem when you think about a healthy format is that everyone has a different definition of what that looks like. For me, having played Pauper in some capacity for, I think at this point it's been about 13 years since I started playing it, when it was a player run event on Magic Online. What you really want to see, and just from observing metagames, is you want to see something where, sure, there might be a best deck or a suite of best decks, but they're never making up so much of the metagame that it's basically pushing everything else out. I threw out a number a couple weeks ago of 12 to 15% is what I would consider like the higher echelon of what could be considered healthy. 12 to 15% of a winner's metagame. And when you're looking at Jeskai, it's 20, 25%. And when you're looking at the Ephemerate engine, it's closer to 28, 29%. By comparison, some of the really, and by comparison, some of the really oppressive decks in Pauper's history, when we're looking at things like Cloudpost Temporal Fissure Storm, or Frantic Search Storm, or Cloud of Fairies enabled decks, those were much more oppressive, with the exception of maybe Cloud of Fairies. I think the most oppressive deck we ever saw was Peregrine Drake combo, which I think on its own was 40% of the winner's metagame, because that deck was it was Splinter Twin. It was, I'm going to play a blue-red mid-range control deck, and I have this combo kill that you can't stop. And I think that's really where we're trending towards. The only difference is that it looks like it's, like was said, 3 or 4 different decks as opposed to this one core engine that is enabling all these different things. Oh, you run Seeker of the Way, you run Aven Rift Watcher, you run Thraben Inspector. The end result is, I'm trying to resolve Muldrifter and Ephemerate, and then Ephemerate on Archaeomancer and take control of the game. And that's really what these decks are all doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And you talk a lot about historical decks that we saw in Pauper, Peregrine Drake, Storm. Look at the ban list and all the decks that those cards were in. And I guess the difference now is that Pauper is sanctioned.
Mhm.
We're, a quote unquote real format. And if we see this continue to be the trend, and I want to get everybody's opinion on this, kind of what is your view of Pauper as a competitive format if nothing were to change?
What do you mean?
Does it have the legs to continue being is it going to be a Jeskai format? And is that good enough? I mean, if you're seeing 62% of the decks run one card draw engine, is that good enough for people to look at Pauper seriously as a competitive format?
I mean, I would say if they left it alone, I still think it has, by my definition, the healthiest metagame of any of the formats, because the thing that I value the most when I play Magic is having choices. And I feel like there are a lot of choices in Pauper as far as like what I can play, what I can do, the way the metagame changes from week to week. So I don't know like what it means to be competitive or not competitive. I found that I care like a lot less about that. I play what I think is fun, and I play what I think by definition is the most interesting Magic. And I think that's Pauper right now. But even if they didn't change anything, I think it's still pretty far above like any of the other like major formats as far as like the amount of choices that you have and how rewarded you get for doing them.
Okay, so is that how you, I guess, would quantify what you consider to be a healthy format? Is the amount of choice that the player has?
That's the metric that I would use. I know Alex mentioned like it's on everybody's going to sort of qualify that based on their own experience and what they think. But like when I sit down to play Magic, I want to like have choices, and I want to look at Magic, the metagame, whatever, like it's a puzzle, and I want to make choices and try and win based on my choices. I don't want all of my choices to feel scripted, where I can just like look at a metagame and be like, well, I'm just playing, Hogak or Phoenix or whatever, because it's just better than everything else, and it's like not even close.
And I actually tend to agree with that. I think that I want the choices you make at every point, whether it's the deck you choose or the cards you choose to put in that specific builder deck, all the way through, your mulligan decisions, how you sequence your lands. I want all of that to matter, but I also want it to. And when I say I want it to matter, what I don't want is someone to go in with a deck that should be competitive, should be something that they can reasonably expect to do well with, and then realize that there's this monster in the corner that is kind of holding everything down. Now, being perfectly honest, I think that Jeskai Ephemerate, Tron Ephemerate, isn't really as offensive as some of these other decks from the past. But at the same time, it's getting to a point where a lot of people who are critical of removing cards from the format are calling it a problem. To be fair, there are people on the other side that feel the same way, that feel that the format is fine, that it still needs time to adjust, that we're still adjusting to Modern Horizons Core 2020. We're getting Throne of Eldraine in a few weeks. I'm definitely on the side of more aggressive when it comes to bans. I think that it's better to take cards out of the format if they kind of consistently overperform or consistently push other strategies out. And then, as we saw with Modern, you can unban cards later. I think that right now Pauper's at this really interesting point because it is just recently sanctioned, because they are just starting to do I guess, what are MCQs and what will be PTQs at some point in the future. Um, I and so I have this really weird thing where I don't want any card to be banned, but I want Pauper to be the healthiest it possibly can be. And I think that when you're seeing time after time Jeskai take up 4 slots in the top 8, 10 slots in the top 16, or 8 slots in the top 16, it's starting to be, well, is there a choice that consistently can beat this while not losing to everything else? And I think that's kind of the pinch point right now, because it's beat Jeskai, and then next week pick a different deck that beats Jeskai that isn't the deck that won last week.
I mean, that's a smart strategy, and that is a choice at the very least.
Yeah.
at the very least, there is a choice. Like, if you want to actually play Magic, like, there are things you can do. So, like, to me, that's something. Like, I'm not gonna say the sky is falling or anything because I don't think it is.
Sure.
But I do see what you're. I also am recognizing that it's becoming the metagame is more and more Jeskai heavy every week. It seems like. But I wonder if you mentioned earlier, Alex, you said you want someone to be able to just like play a deck that should be good and be able to like have some success with it. I kind of think a lot of people who are doing that just like look at the metagame and they're like, well, this Jeskai deck is insane, and they just play that. So it just feels like there's just tons of Jeskai. Because it's like such an obvious good deck, and it's also a deck people like to play because it does cool things. Like I get to blink a Mole Drifter and draw a bunch of cards and play Counterspell and Lightning Bolt and Scred and Astrolabe and loot my Astrolabe with my. I mean, this deck just sounds sweet. Like it's what every Magic player. It's how every Magic player dreams about winning, in a sense. You know what I mean?
It reminds me of these like 4-color Jeskai lists from like the Cons and Dragons era, where it was so many charms and 3 and 4-color spells, or 3-color spells from that era were just good stuff decks. I think Jeskai's dominating a lot of what decks people play because it's still shifting and evolving. So it's you may prepare for one build of it, but you may face a build that's 6 or 7 cards different, and those 7 cards matter a lot.
The other thing I love about these big tournaments is it seems like Jeskai is pretty consistently like not the winner. It's always like the deck that gets in that isn't Jeskai that was good this week always wins, which I think is actually kind of awesome. Because it's like the person who is doing that thing, like playing the game rather than just playing the good deck, is like the one who seems to be getting the Pro Tour invite, which is pretty sweet.
Yeah, that just happens to have been Boggles every time.
And Elves, or I guess this isn't the Pro Tour one or whatever, but
yeah, the MCQ was won by a Boggles deck.
Both of them.
Both Pauper MCQs were won by Boggles decks. But if you're just looking at the challenges, which are these weekly tournaments that aren't as big as these playoffs, out of the 10 since Core 2020 hit, 3 were won by a Jeskai deck. 2 the kind of general Jeskai value, and then 1 that won with Trinket Mage. And that's kind of where you kind of see some of that split where I'm a Trinket Mage deck. I sometimes run a copy of Relic of Progenitus. But combined, those 2 decks have 37 of the top 8s. The deck that's won the most challenges since Core 2020 is Stompy. It's won 3, which is... I've been on the receiving end of some Stompy beats. Brian's well aware of that. But it's this thing where, like you said, Jeskai isn't winning every week. It's the deck that's best positioned. But at some point, when you're looking at 37 top 8s out of 88 top 8 total, and that doesn't count some of the fringier 4-color Jeskai decks or 5-color Astrolabe decks that also run the Ephemerate engine, that's a lot of top 8s. It's eating up a lot of winner space.
Yeah, and to me, a good format kind of means that there are multiple different strategies that have a legitimate claim to saying they might be the best deck. Maybe not just the best deck for a given tournament, but might be the best deck overall. And the only time I really feel, in my personal opinion, that bans should come into play is when a card is printed that feels like it's a skeleton key to just unlocking the most powerful strategy. Either being, an uncost or undercosted value engine or what have you. And I feel like Ephemerate is kind of pushing itself toward that. And I guess the question that I ask myself is, okay, maybe there's 2 or 3 versions of this Jeskai deck that are good, and 2 or 3 versions of Tron with Ephemerate that are good. But is that enough variation to really say they're taking up, different parts of the metagame? Or is that just the same engine, wearing 2 different colored shirts?
I think that when, in talking to people who have played a lot of Tron and a lot of Jeskai, I think one thing that comes to mind is that Tron isn't as popular on Magic Online, mostly because there's a dexterity issue in that you're trying to race the clock. You're trying to either lock your opponent out with Stonehorn Dignitary, and it's a failing of Magic Online where you can't just say I'm going to do this 10 times. You have to physically go through the motions, and you can time out, you can lose clock, and people are playing to win. So in some of these larger tournaments, no one is going to concede. So what ends up happening is that the people who are able to succeed with Tron are those who are willing to put in the practice of doing the click-throughs, which I don't have the numbers on paper tournaments. Sadly, those aren't as robust and publicized. But if you look at some of the video, I believe, of the MCQ that happened at Magic Fest LA, you can see, Joseph Arani, you can see the Tron player in that say, I'm going to do this X times. And that's something you can't do through the Magic Online client. And so I think that Tron is actually underrepresented online because of this reason.
Well, that said, I'm glad that you brought up people who play Tron a lot online, because I knew we were going to be talking about this a little bit today. So I, messaged Birdman actually on Discord, and I asked him what he thought about the format, because as a Tron player who's winning a ton of trophies with Tron, if he's going to have a bias, it's going to be toward liking his deck being powerful. So I asked him, what do you think about the health of the Pauper metagame right now? And he said, you get two choices. You play an Ephemerate deck, or you get lucky with an aggro deck. And a healthy format doesn't warp around one card. And a healthy format, you're going to be able to point to a mid-range aggro control deck, all three of those that can, to some degree, counter each other. And I tend to agree with him.
I think Jeskai taking up a lot of the mid-range deck space is a problem that isn't just solved by Magic Online being easier to play Tron or the Familiars combo. Like, I still think they're eating up all that mid-range deck space.
Yeah, Jeskai is just it. It is what people like to do. It draws cards, it counters spells, it gets to run loops, and it has taken up a huge chunk of the what has traditionally been divided up between those Boros Monarch decks, Mono Black Control, and other various mid-range decks that aren't as popular as those two, or have been as popular as those two. I mean, the testament to the Jeskai deck is that it has completely pushed Monarch to the outskirts of the format. Monarch was a dominant card draw engine for as long as it had been printed until Ephemerate showed up. And now Boros Monarch has gone from clearly a tier 1 deck to kind of a fringe tier 2 player. And that should say something when one of the more dominant decks has basically been completely pushed aside, especially with one that has a mechanic that's kind of as unfair as the Monarch, a mechanic not designed for 2-player Magic.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've talked a lot about what constitutes a healthy format. Do you guys consider Pauper healthy right now? I know, Brian, you've already kind of weighed in on this in your previous answer. Or
Yes,
I guess let's put it a different way. Talk about a time historically, Alex. You said you've been playing Pauper since it's existed.
Mm-hmm.
When you thought Pauper was, in its best form, and the answer could be now, or you could say you've never thought it was a healthy format. Completely up to you.
So I'll actually say that right now I think it's a lot healthier than it was when Gush was legal, than when Cloud of Fairies was legal, than when Peregrine Drake was legal. I think right now there's just a bigger spotlight on the format, so there are more people combing through it and looking for what's going on. I think the healthiest Pauper ever was right after Peregrine Drake was banned, and before. I think it was right after Peregrine Drake was banned, and right before Modern Masters 15 was released, or was it whichever one had Burning Tree Emissary, Denrover Horror, and Augur of Bolus downshifted.
That
There
was
was a
Iconic Masters, I believe.
it was a Modern Masters,
Was it?
and it was 15 or 17. I think it was actually 17. Um, and so there was a span of time for
Oh.
about 4 months where the format was diverse. There were a couple decks who were trying to lay claim to the best deck. And what ended up happening is when Drake left, is it Delver, or rather at that point it was actually just Delver was still around. There were some blue black Delver decks. There was mono black control. There was Stompy. There was Boggles. There was Elves. There was Tron. There were all these decks, and you didn't really know which one was the best. And I'm sure we could go back and look and be, this was the best deck for that time period, but there wasn't one that was miles above the rest. What happened with Modern Master 17 is very quickly Stompy became the best deck thanks to Burning Tree Emissary, but then Is It Delver really kind of laid that claim because of Augur of Bolas, because of Ash Barons, which got released. And at that same point, that's when the Monarch cards made their way to Magic Online. So you had this complete upending of the metagame, not to mention Dunrover Horror getting printed and becoming, the go-to Tron endgame. So that span from, I think it was like November 2016. Actually, I remember I was flying down to Florida for my sister's wedding when I got the news that Peregrine Drake was going to be banned. So that was November 2016 through March of 2017. I think that's when Pauper was at its healthiest.
Yeah, no, I personally would agree with you there for one thing, but there have been a few times that I felt like Pauper was in a really good place, and I think we might disagree on one of them because I think it was maybe a year and a half, 2 years ago when we had a meta that had three best decks. We had Boros, we had Delver, we had Tron, and then there was a large number of what I would consider, tier 1.5 decks. You had your Elves, Mono Black, Stompy. You had any number of decks right below that that felt like they had game even against the top decks. And it felt like you never really saw the same thing twice. Like you didn't, I guess there were one-off times where Delver maybe dominated a top 8, but it never felt like there was that one oppressive strategy that you either play it or you play to beat it. And I had a lot of fun playing. I still have a lot of fun playing Pauper now, but that was, kind of in my mind, the heyday, I guess, for the format. I don't want to give the wrong impression and make people think that, I'm saying that Pauper is doomed and that the format's terrible now. I like the format right now. I play it every single day. But I do think there have been times when, the dial was turned just right and the format felt wide open and like there were real unplumbed depths that nobody had gotten to yet, and there was more to discover. That said, it's not like Wizards of the Coast just ruined the format for no reason. Blue Black Delver became a real problem once that deck was discovered, and obviously something had to be done, and that's when you saw the blue bans. What about you, Dave?
I started in March of 18. That was my first tournament. And I can't say I've disliked any of the formats. It felt like a lot of change at a lot of different points with new sets being released. So, Burning Tree's always been a part of my Pauper experience. I mean, I was brewing before that, but I was thinking I could just play Treasure Cruise and Cloud of Fairies, and I was like, oh, this is great. And I learned about the ban list. I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense because those did seem a little bit too good. But I love playing Daze and Gush and Snuff Out and Get Taxi and Probe in my Blue Black Delver deck. Like I pretty much was the guy at our store playing that deck, and I was like, I don't know what you guys are talking about. This deck's great, and it's like I like the Legacy Light aspect of the format. I also like where the mana's been opened up. Ash Baron's been around since I've been playing it, but with Astrolabe, I like kind of what the flavor of that's taken on too. I think it remains to be seen if it's healthy, if it's still being dominated by Jeskai in 6 months from now. Then I think at that point something has to be done. Maybe not even 6 months, but I don't know if that'll remain to be the case. But I could see that being in an unhealthy state. But I've never felt like something needed to to happen. I think paper is a different story than digital too. So I only really have played paper up until about 2 weeks ago. And then online, I was very frustrated with the Magic Online, and I'm like, okay, no, this is not for me. I like playing in paper, and Tron is more prevalent in paper. And what's the Torch of Existence? I don't think you probably see that online that much.
My favorite deck.
Yeah, so me only playing in paper, I think if we could actually separate paper results from online results, then we could start to say, well, the online meta is this and the paper meta is this. So really, let's just fix Magic Online and bring it into the new millennium of coding. But I think Pauper, as I play it in paper, is just fine.
And well, that brings up an interesting point that I hadn't really considered before just now. And that would be, is it okay if a format is amazing in paper and can be tedious and not as fun on Magic Online?
Well, Magic Online is just kind of tedious. It's like just kind of what it is.
As someone who plays basically almost all their Pauper on Magic Online, as long as the overall environment for the metagame is healthy, I think that's fine. I think that you're going to see, you see this all the time with Magic Online results. In Modern specifically, Burn is kind of overrepresented because it's very easy to acquire those cards on Magic Online. And you see this a lot in other formats where it's certain decks are overrepresented because the cards are easy to acquire. But more than that, they can let you cycle through wins quickly. When a 5-0 is worth so much more than a 4-1 in a league play, your best bet is to pick a deck that can go 4-1 quickly, 5-0 quickly, or bomb out quickly, and then you can re-queue. So you see Burn is overrepresented. Is Burn as popular in paper Modern as it is in online Modern? I don't play a ton of Modern, so I can't say that. But
well, the case is the same in Pauper, that
exactly.
Burn is overrepresented online.
Yeah. But if, again, the format is healthy in aggregate, that matters. And that's why I wish we had more access to paper tournaments. We do get, there's the Pauper-Geddon tournaments out in Italy, which always have interesting top 8s and top 16s. We've been getting some more results from Brazil as of late. And I know that there was a Pauper championship not that long ago in Japan that was won by a Jeskai deck. So it's not as if this deck doesn't exist in the, for lack of a better term, the tabletop world. But I also think that you see a lot of tournaments like the Rags to Riches where people have their Pauper deck. You see more Tortured Existence. You see more Tron. You see more decks that people can... there are loops that they need to demonstrate, but they can demonstrate those loops. So I think that, judging from what just we see online, it doesn't look the healthiest, but I don't have all the data. The people who do have all the data are the ones who make the decisions.
Alex, you made a point earlier where you were talking about, when we were talking about the best version of Pauper, and you said it was like right after Peregrine Drake, and then there was a master set where they dumped in like the Dinarova Horror and Burning Tree Emissary. It really seems like a lot of the action in the format has been Wizards sort of like forcing change into the format. Like, here's a bunch of insanely good cards, and like the format just like dynamically changes with a release. I wonder if like sort of the balancing mechanism, right now I can see the writing on the wall where it's like every week we're creeping a couple of points more in the Jeskai direction. But I wonder if like sort of Wizards' thought for this is like, we'll just dump like 5 more powerful cards into every set, and we'll just like throw it, in another direction. We'll throw you a curveball, rather than having to like, in the olden days of Magic, the cards weren't as powerful, so it was like, this card is good, so it's going to be good for the next 15 years. But if we're going to just be consistently getting cards like Ephemerate, Astrolabe, just upped power level cards, it could like dynamically shift the format like almost every time there's a release, or at least every time there's like a Masters release with multiple downshifts.
And I think that's interesting because for a while the format has been defined by cards released in Downshift, or we talked about Modern Masters 2017, but then you look at something like Iconic Masters, which I think it was Iconic Masters that brought Seeker of the Way and Lead the Stampede. And then you have 25th Anniversary Masters, which didn't really bring much. But then you have Ultimate Masters, which brought a few niche cards. Dimir Guildmage, one of my favorite cards, but Resurrection. These cards that were interesting and role players. And then you see Modern Horizons, which is the other end of the spectrum, which has just brought format warping cards to the table. And so I think Pauper is an incredibly hard format to design for at a balanced level because you have so many considerations. You have limited, and then you have legacy, standard, modern, all these other formats, and then you have to hit this narrow band where a card is good enough to see constructed play, but not so good that it's going to be Sparksmith Unlimited.
Alex, real quick, you mentioned Ultimate Masters, and you totally glossed over the most busted card in the whole set, that being Foil, which
Oh yeah, I knew there was
literally
one I was
broke the whole
missing.
format wide open.
Well, and I see this a lot. Like, was Foil the broken card, or was it Gush? I mean, Gush has a pedigree, and Gush is a pretty broken card. Not saying Foil's not good, but once you took Gush out, Foil has seen no play. And if we had taken Foil out, I can guarantee Gush would still be seeing play.
Well, right, Gush would still be seeing play because there were decks like Tireless Tribe and Is It Blitz and Mono Blue Delver and other decks that played the card outside of just the Blue Black Delver deck. And that's something that I've kind of noticed as a trend in the past where Wizards tends to ban what I consider to be the wrong half of broken combos. Like, for instance, there have been, you look at half the ban list, and if you ban Ghostly Flicker instead, then you can still have a lot of those cards. And in that case, they banned Gush rather than the card that started it being a problem, that being Foil, in my opinion at least.
I think that I was against the Ghostly Flicker ban for a long time, and now with Displace and Ephemerate, I think that you can make a case for it now. But I think the question becomes what, and this is something that has never really been clearly articulated, is what Pauper should be. Because if you look at the ban list, almost every card on there cheats the mana system in some way, with the exception of Cranial Plating. But when you look at almost every
Affinity
other
does enough mana cheating as it is.
yeah, but when you look at every other card on there, each one has its own way of subverting the mana system. Between the Storm cards, which I pay 2 for this minor effect, but I actually get 10, 20 spells worth of effect. Whether it's Cloud of Fairies and Peregrine Drake and Frantic Search, which are effectively free, but in actuality generate mana. Whether it's Gush or Daze or Gataxian Probe, these new ads that are quote unquote free spells, Treasure Cruise, Invigorate. These are spells that you can't cost them effectively because they break the rules of mana. And I think that Wizards, for the most part, has been consistent on the ban list for banning cards that are subverting the mana system. Cloud Post, for example. And what that tells me is that they want Pauper to be a format that might be able to do unfair things, but wants to do it with a fair mana base. Wants to do it with, basically one land drop, 1 mana. Now, I could be wrong. This is just an observation, but I'm interested to see what happens next. I think that when because with your point about Ghostly Flicker, what's more cool, being able to double use your enter the battlefield effects, or getting free mana with Peregrine Drake, and Cloud of Fairies. And I don't think there's necessarily a right answer there, but I think that the direction Wizards has taken has been take away the thing that breaks how mana works traditionally.
I see the way they banned the blue bans with Daze, Gush, and Get Probe really lend itself to get new players into the format. Like if you're playing Modern and they're tapped out, I mean, now I guess you have the new Force, and they could have Pact Negation, but generally you're safe to do your thing, and you're not going to get snuff outed or dazed and gush and draw cards and foil and all this stuff when you're like, what, he's tapped out. Like if I'm a newer player, that's a lot of feel bads going on when I feel like everything up to this point in standard, or maybe I dipped my toe in modern or limited, and now I go to Pauper and everything's flying at me, even when they tapped out and they played Delver on turn one and they played another creature. And I think for me, that's what my initial take was limit the field bets for any new player and kind of tone down, if they're tapped out, the range of just a volume of the free things they could do.
For sure. Well, we are coming up a little bit close on our time here, but one thing I did want to kind of talk about before we go is, everybody on this cast right now has some form of investment in the future of Pauper, and I think it's fair for me to say that we all want the format to succeed. So, in your opinion, and I'll just go around quickly, what can be done to make the format better? Alex, you want to start us off?
Yeah, I would like to see more engine style cards printed, more powerful cards printed at common, but ones that make sense. One card that has caught my eye out of Throne of Eldraine is, oh god, I don't know the name, but it's that Merchant. It's 2 and a red for a 2/3, but it has Adventure, and the Adventure is discard a card if you do draw a card, and then it comes in as a 2/3 for 3, and you can pay 2 to rummage. That's a powerful effect on the adventure side of things, and it could enable a whole bunch of stuff. I really like the cycle of common lands that have, if you have 3 other swamps, it enters untapped, and if it does, it's just a free Mortuary Mire, costs nothing, and it's a swamp, so you can get it with Twisted Abomination. Those are powerful cards that could have an impact. I want to see more things like that, and maybe ones that maybe even a little more powerful. At the same time, I want those cards to have a chance to matter. And so I hope that when we see the entire spoiler at the end of this week, we're just going to be blown away at the cards that are available. And, when they get released, everything's going to shake out all right. I, however, am also for aggressive management of the ban list, and that means adding cards or taking away cards as necessary. But obviously, the first line of defense is adding cards to the format. Failing that, take stuff away. I want choices to matter. I want there to be a variety of decks that you can play and succeed with on a fairly consistent basis. But I don't want it to be, one of the criticisms that get lobbied at people who are more advocating for bans is they want the format just to be mid-range bears smashing into each other, and I don't want it to be that. I want the format to be fun, and right now it still can be fun, but I worry that as Jeskai continues to kind of go everywhere, that it might be trending in the other direction.
Okay. Real quick, you mentioned unbanning cards. Anything in particular you have your eye on in that respect? I want to see Daze back.
You and a lot of people, but I actually like the ban list. I don't think anything really needs to come off or should come off for that matter. Having lived through just about every card on there, I'm very happy with where the ban list is right now.
All right.
I would unban him.
Fair enough.
Just straight away, I would do that. I would have done it last time, right from the beginning.
Asked and
That's
answered.
where I'm at.
I would unban Daze. I would ban Ephemerate. I would downshift Stigma Lasher and Skullcrack, or Stigma Lasher and Flames of the Blood Hand.
Skullcrack, you say?
Yep.
Oh, Alex, I have an interesting question for you.
Go
You
ahead.
could downshift any card. What would you downshift?
Oh man, so for a long time my answer to this question was Fork Bolt, but then they just released it as a common, even though it's not legal in Magic Online yet. Um, the really incredibly selfish answer of mine is Animate Dead, but I don't know if they could easily print that on a card. I love reanimator strategies, and I think that a reliable reanimator strategy would actually be a benefit to the format right now, because it would put pressure on in the early game. At the same time, I know that people would get sick of turn 2 Ulamog's Crushers very quickly.
I got sick of a turn 2 Ulamog's Crusher the very first time it ever happened to me, and that's without Animate Dead. So I am hard pass on Animate Dead for me. Dave, you brought up Skullcrack, and I just wanted to ask you. We talked to Chris Van Meter, and he was talking about his answer to this question. Actually, was Tybalt Rakish Instigator. Bring a Planeswalker to the format. You get the cannot gain life effect. What do you guys think about that?
Yeah, I was talking to somebody, and the creature only side of Tybalt was the discussion of, before War of the Spark, if they do make a Planeswalker, what would be too much? And it was like, oh, well, how about basically Tybalt minus the creatures being devils was the thing. But I think that'd be another fine inclusion too. Not a tick-upable Planeswalker, but yeah, Tybalt seems like he could be a common.
I mean, you could just downshift Narset and answer all these Mole Drifter shenanigans really quickly.
Oh, I thought we were talking about improving the format. All right, we've clearly gone off the rails. Alex,
Sorry about
I want to
that,
give you a
Chris.
chance to. No, you're perfectly fine. I want to give you a chance here. I know we said, you only have a certain amount of time. So, anything you want to add to the conversation, or anything you want to say to our listeners before we let you go?
I mean, listen, Pauper is great. I know that I sometimes take this really analytical eye to looking at how much of the metagame is this, how much of the metagame is that. But at the end of the day, it's still this amazing format that is a ton of fun. I just want to make sure, like with whatever I do, that it is the most accessible fun for the most people as possible. I love this format. I want to see it succeed long after I stop writing about it, long after that next generation of Pauper content creators comes and goes. I want to see Pauper be, a main event and a Magic Fest. I want to see more of these MCQs. So I want it to be accessible, I want it to be fun, and I want it to provide this really interesting, dynamic gameplay. And I think that everyone who cares passionately about this format wants the same thing. So that's really where I'm coming from. I think we all want the same thing, and we all just have different ways of wanting to get there.
Well said.
Yeah, absolutely. So if people want to hear more from you, you want to go ahead and let them know how to do that? We'll include it in the show notes as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So you can find me on Twitter. I'm at Nerd to the Core. I also have a Facebook page where I kind of collect all the stuff I do. It's the same thing. I have articles that go up on Channel Fireball. If you search my name, you'll also see what I do. I do news posts there as well, collecting the news for the week, but there's a ton of Pauper stuff on there as well. And if you follow me about once a week, I also update my personal blog, which is nerdtothecore.blogspot.com, with just a recap of the most recent challenge from Magic Online.
Yeah, it's always a good read. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. Hopefully we'll have you back on in the future. This was episode 8, guys. It was a lot of fun, and hopefully we'll see you next week.
Thanks for having me.